Chapter 4.1 Judaism, Origin and Theology. Among the religions of the Roman Empire in the 1st century, Judaism held a unique place. It was national, having originated with the Jewish people, and yet it was not confined to them, for its proselytes were numbered by the hundreds. It was not the only cult that emphasized the worship of one God, but unlike the others it was exclusively monotheistic in the sense that its adherents were not allowed to worship or even to admit the existence of any other god or gods. Other religions had temples and sacrificial worship, but in no other faith did the temple with its imageless sanctuary play so great a part or hold the single allegiance of so large a company of people. Many of the philosophies had well-articulated ethical systems, but the ethics of Judaism were inherent in the nature of its worship and were rigidly enforced upon all of its adherents. Most of the ethnic religions of the day were founded on tradition or on mystic intuition. Judaism was based on a revelation from God recounted in the sacred scriptures of the Law and the Prophets, which claimed to be the reproduction of the words of God himself as he spoke to his chosen servants. Some understanding of Judaism is indispensable to the student of the New Testament, for Christianity is the child of Judaism. The books of the New Testament, with two exceptions, were written by Jews. The teachings of the New Testament concerning God, man, sin, salvation, law, grace, prayer, and many other subjects fundamental to the Christian life, strike their roots back into Old Testament soil. Even the arguments of the New Testament against legalism are drawn from statements in the Old Testament, and the text of the writings of the Apostolic Age is filled with Old Testament quotations. Christians were first known as the sect of the Nazarenes, Acts 24-5:14, which was regarded as a rivulet from the mainstream of Judaism. Jesus himself was a Jew who was born of a Jewish family, Matt 1:16, and was circumcised as all Jewish male infants were, Luke 2:21. He was taken to Jerusalem as a boy that he might participate in the Passover feast, 2:41, and throughout his life he observed Jewish customs and moved in Jewish society. The present rift between Christianity and Judaism is not the result of a wide difference in historical and theological origins. It is the outcome of the repudiation of the Lord Jesus by the Jewish people. As John said, he came unto his own, and they that were his own received him not. John 1:11. The origin. Judaism as it existed in the 1st century was largely the product of the exile. Prior to the captivity, the people of Israel and Judah had given only spasmodic loyalty to the law. The worship of Jehovah had been their rightful and official faith, but it had frequently been more honored in the breach than in the observance. In the 9th century BC, the entire northern kingdom had been alienated to the worship of Baal under the influence of Jezebel, Ahab's Phoenician queen, and had been brought back to the worship of Jehovah only by the heroic ministry of Elijah. Similarly, the temple worship of the southern kingdom fell into neglect and disuse during the reigns of Manasseh and of Amon in the 8th century, who sponsored the introduction of foreign deities. Under Josiah's vigorous administration, the temple was cleansed, the worship of Jehovah was restored, and the book of the law which was brought to light during the reconstruction of the temple was put back in its rightful place of authority. 2 Chronicles 34-1-33. As long as the people lived in Palestine, surrounded by prosperous and powerful heathen neighbors and subjected to their influence, they were tempted to experiment with alien worship and to desert the God of their fathers. The prophets protested in vain against this tendency which had appeared during the wilderness wanderings of the people, Numbers 25-1-3, and which had persisted even to the period of the captivity and exile, Ezekiel 14-1-5, Jeremiah 7:16-20. The captivity confronted the Jewish people with a stem alternative. Either they must commit themselves utterly to the worship of Jehovah, the one true God, by which allegiance they would retain the genius and purpose of the national existence, or they would be absorbed both religiously and politically by the nations among whom they were driven into exile. If they were to choose the former alternative, they would have to pay closer attention to the requirements of the law, and they would have to devise some means of worship to take the place of the temple ritual which had ceased with the destruction of the central building and with the subsequent dispersion of the priesthood. The book of the law could be carried with them to their new resting place, but the cult of the temple, as far as they could see, was gone forever. While the captives of the southern kingdom were in Babylonia in the 6th century BC, the new Judaism began to take form. Idolatry was first banned. Whereas the worship of Baal and of other Canaanite deities had been madly espoused prior to the capture of Jerusalem, the bitter discipline of the captivity schooled the survivors to look toward Jehovah. The whole spirit of the book of Daniel, in which all participation in heathen worship is scorned and in which Daniel and his friends avowed their will to worship Jehovah alone at any cost, is a witness to the salutary change in spiritual temper which came over the exiles. With the enforced cessation of sacrifice, the study of the law, or Torah, began to take its place. In the kingdoms, the individual worshipper may have relied largely upon participation in public worship as an expression of his faith. That expression may have been sincere, but it could hardly have been as vital as the personal study of God's precepts could become. In the reform of Josiah, the law was read to the people, 2 Chronicles 34-29, 30, as a special feature of a reforming movement. But in the exile there was an increasing tendency for each man to study the law for himself. The scribe, like Ezra, who studied and interpreted the law, became as important a personage among the people as the priest had been while the temple was standing. Ezra 7-1-6. In the days of Jesus, the scribes were potent figures in the religion of Judaism. A new center of worship was established by the rise of the synagogue. The wide dispersion of the people in the captivity and their wanderings in the years that followed made some local form of gathering necessary. Even when the temple was re-established, there were many who could not attend its ceremonies. In order to hold them together around the study of the law, wherever 10 men could be found to form a regular congregation, synagogues were created in the various communities where they lived. In these the people gathered for prayer and for worship on the 7th day of the week. So firmly established was the synagogue as an institution that it continued even after the rebuilding of the temple, and in the 1st century in Jerusalem there were synagogues which carried on their activities concurrently with those of the temple, Acts 6-9. Although no mention of the synagogue as such occurs in the Old Testament, there can be little doubt that it grew up in the years between the captivity and the advent of Christ, for in his lifetime it was flourishing in Palestine. The religious life that grew up around the synagogue was an adaptation of the older rites and observances of Judaism to the new conditions under which the people had to live. Many of them had been moved from the pastoral and agricultural life of Palestine to the busy commercial activity of great cities. Feasts could not be observed with all the features that might be utilized in village worship. Problems and queries prompted by the new life called for new answers. New influences from the Gentile world surrounding them pressed in upon them with great force. Some changes were inevitable, but in the main Judaism retained the essential principles of the older worship prescribed by the law and preached by the prophets. Next is the theology. Central to the whole faith of Judaism was its tenacious belief in the unity and transcendence of Jehovah. In contrast to the multiplicity of deities which the heathen world acknowledged, the Jew guarded jealously his short, sharp creed of Deuteronomy 6-4. Hear, O Israel! Jehovah our God is one Jehovah. Jewish exclusivism in worship is amply attested by the attitude which the Gentiles took toward them. They were generally accused of atheism, not because they denied the existence of any god at all, but because they consistently refused to recognize the reality of any deity except their own. Among the rabbinic teachers, considerable emphasis was placed upon the fatherhood of God. The introductory phrase of the Lord's Prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, was no novelty. Isaiah had addressed God with this title, For thou art our Father, though Abraham knoweth us not, and Israel doth not acknowledge us. Thou, O Jehovah, art our Father. Our Redeemer from everlasting is thy name. Isaiah 63-16. Rabbi Akiba taught that the Israelites were sons of God. Beloved of God are the Israelites, in that they shall be called sons of God. Still more beloved in that it is made known to them that they are called sons of God. Deuteronomy 14-1. This personal relation of God to Israel as expressed by the figure of fatherhood was emphasized chiefly by Palestinian teachers. Philo, who belonged to the Hellenistic wing of Judaism, had a more philosophic conception of God. God is eternal, unchangeable, holy, free, and perfect. Because he is superior to all other beings, he is not definable by comparison with them, since definition would thus be equivalent to limitation. This concept illustrates a trend toward depersonalizing God which is still extant in modern Judaism. God thus becomes an actual but a vague and shadowy being concerning whose character and attitudes no definite assertions can be made. Perhaps this uncertainty about the nature of God, which sprang originally from a hesitation to limit him, was the reason for the indefiniteness expressed in John 1:18. No man hath seen God at any time. At this point, Christianity went beyond Judaism by presenting a God who was not only sole God and real, but who was also personal and knowable. Man, according to Jewish theology, was the creation of God, endowed with the ability to choose between obedience and disobedience to God's revealed law, and by so doing to choose the consequences of life and of death. Deuteronomy 30-11-20. Man's chief end in life was to keep the commandments of God and to maintain all of the forms that were prescribed for the people as a whole, namely, circumcision, the observance of the Sabbath, the various annual feasts, and worship in the synagogue. The law summarized the whole duty of man and established his relation to God. Sin for the Jew consisted chiefly in a wrong relationship to the revealed law of God. The failure to obey one of its prescriptions, whether weighty, such as the command, "Thou shalt not kill," or light, such as the prohibition of taking a bird from the nest with her fledglings or with the eggs, 22:6-7, was regarded as a sin. This Jewish attitude is reflected in the New Testament in James 2:10, "For whosoever shall keep the whole law, and yet stumble in one point, he is become guilty of all." Judaism drew no distinction between the moral and ceremonial law, for both were inextricably connected with the life of the people as a whole. Severance from the elect people, which was the penalty for sin, was meted out to all offenders, not only upon those who had committed some outrageous crime or who neglected some fundamental ordinance such as circumcision, but also upon those who ate flesh with blood remaining in it. Leviticus 17:14. In the period before the exile, rewards and punishments were connected with the fate of the nation as a whole. If the nation observed God's law and worshipped him alone, it prospered. If the nation lapsed into idolatry and into neglect of the law, it suffered political and economic reverses. Sin was thus evaluated and judged on a communal scale rather than individually. There was, of course, personal consciousness of sin, as Psalm 51 shows, but the social and national implications of the individual's conduct were more marked in Judaism than they are in modern Protestant Christianity. The uprooting of the nation in the captivity tended to destroy the connection of reward and punishment with ebb and flow of national prosperity in the land. The captivity itself was a discipline which the nation must endure until such time as God should see fit to restore them, but in the interim the generations that should be born and die must face the issues of life and death for themselves. This was the problem that confronted Ezekiel. When he was told by the fatalists of his day that the fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge, he replied that one's relation to God is not determined by the sins or by the virtues of one's ancestors but by his own. Ye shall not have occasion, as I live, saith the Lord Jehovah, any more to use this proverb in Israel. Behold, all souls are mine. As the soul of the Father, so also the soul of the Son is mine. The soul that sinneth thee, it shall die. Ezekiel 18:3-4. This reaffirmation of individual responsibility accords with the position of Judaism as it is reflected in the New Testament. The rich young ruler showed deep concern for his individual relation to God in spite of the fact that he felt that he had kept completely all the precepts of the moral law. Matthew 19:16-22. Communal responsibility was transferred from the people as inhabitants of a land to the people as the elect of God, whose manifestation of that election lay in their social solidarity rather than in their location. The theology of punishment and of reward, when applied to the individual life, opened the question of immortality and of the life hereafter. Little is given in the Old Testament concerning these subjects. Jacob and David both alluded to Sheol, a dim and shadowy region of the dead, where they might be reunited with their children who had suffered an untimely death. Genesis 37-35, 2 Samuel 12:23. Nowhere in the earlier records is there any direct statement concerning the resurrection of the body, although Jesus interpreted God's declaration to Moses, "I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob," Exodus 3-6. To mean that he was not the God of the dead but of the living. Matter. W 22:32. The suggestion of resurrection emerges first in the poetical books and later in the prophets. The 16th Psalm, attributed to David, says, "For thou wilt not leave my soul to Sheol, neither wilt thou suffer thy Holy One to see corruption. Thou wilt show me the path of life. In thy presence is fullness of joy. In thy right hand there are pleasures for evermore." Psalm 16:10-11. Isaiah, in predicting the future judgments of God and the salvation of Israel, says, "Thy dead shall live. My dead bodies shall arise. Awake and sing, ye that dwell in the dust. For thy dew is as the dew of herbs, and the earth shall cast forth the dead." Isaiah 26-19. In Daniel also occurs a prediction of resurrection. "And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." Daniel 12-2.